Kick On Book Club. I'm here with Liam McIlvanney to talk about his latest book, The Heretic. If you could give us a summary of it, please, Liam, that's great.
Well, thanks first of all for having me on your show, Alex. It's great to catch up with you after all this time.
No problem.
It's such a long
thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's such a long time since I wrote the thing as well that you're probably better placed to summarise the book than I am. I can never remember what's happened in my books once I've sort of sent them off and they appear. But this is basically the sequel to my 2018 book, The Quaker. It features the same protagonist, Duncan McCormick, who I sent away to London he ran away to join the Met at the end of The Quaker. So he's actually back in Glasgow for this book. This is 6 years later. It's 1975 now. And Duncan McCormick has returned to Glasgow after his spell with the Met. And he's got his plate full. There's the murder of a local businessman and former Conservative MP. There's an explosion. A bomb goes off in a gangster pub in Maryhill in Glasgow. And McCormick has to sort of investigate those happenings, and as you might imagine, the threads begin to tie together. But that's essentially where we are with The Heretic.
There's quite, as you say, there's quite a few threads, but over 15 hours of audio. That does go pretty well.
Yeah, poor old Angus King, the audio guy has got his work cut out for him in reading for that length of time, but he does a great job.
Yeah. Why did you decide to have a 6-year break between the stories?
Well, I didn't actually intend for the Duncan McCormick for this to be a series at all, Alex, is the honest answer. I wrote The Quaker as a standalone, and it was only when my editor at HarperCollins, Julia Wisdom, said, this guy's quite interesting, there might be the basis for a series here, that I began to think, well, that might not be a bad idea, and think about how to bring him back. So, of course, if I had realised that this might be a series, I would have done things differently, I think, in the Quaker, and I wouldn't have sent him off to London at the end. So I toyed with the idea of setting a book in London in the 70s, and then I sort of came to my senses and realised that wasn't the job for me. And so I thought I'll just sort of leave a few years and then bring him back to Glasgow once the dust has settled. So yeah, it was basically just a way to sort of move things on slightly, and I suppose deal with a slightly different period in the city's history. And I suppose I've now got the idea that I might do that for subsequent books and sort of move things along at a bit of a clip, and try and cover a reasonably long period of Glasgow's recent history in the books.
It's quite interesting you say that, because we were just talking about Val McDermott, because she's got a 10-year gap between her
Indeed, yeah. So it'd be the same kind of thing. So I've got a 6-year gap between the Quaker and the Heretic. The next book, The Penitent, is set in 1981. So there's going to be another 6-year gap. So my idea is that I'll probably finish it in 1990, when it's a nice sort of turning point in the modern history of the city, when Glasgow became the European capital of culture for the year, and it seems to sort of mark that transition from the kind of bad old Glasgow to a Glasgow trying to reinvent itself to some extent. So yeah, I suppose the books would then take you from Bible John in 1969 to City of Culture in 1990, which would be a nice wee sort of period of the city's history.
Yeah. Why did you decide to start it with Bible John?
It's one of these series of murders that I think just sticks with people of my age and background growing up in the west of Scotland at that time. You know, I was born in '69, the year of the final Bible John killings, and it was one of those events that sort of was always there in the background as you were growing up in the west of Scotland. So I think I always knew that I was going to write about it at some stage. It's a wee bit like, it's kind of a JFK moment. Writers keep going back to Andrew Hagen wrote a brilliant section of The Missing on Bible John, and of course Ian Rankin touches on it in Black and Blue. I think there's a new book coming out, another non-fiction book about Bible John, just about to hit the shelves too. So it's one of these subjects of perennial interest for people from the west of Scotland.
Yeah, we were talking about that in my earlier interview with you in 2018, which was on my blog. But just to let the readers know about it, I was asking you about why you gave the characters a kind of a split narrative, because you gave the victims a look through, I think it was letters, I think, in the Quaker.
Yeah, so I've got 3 chapters in the Quaker from, I suppose, the perspective of the murdered women, which was a slightly odd, to some extent, thing to do in a crime novel, to sort of introduce almost a supernatural dimension, I suppose, with these chapters from beyond the grave. But that was, I suppose, that was just a way of trying to give an insight into the interior life of these women, and not just have them simply as plot points in a crime novel. But I found when I was writing these chapters that they were the chapters that I enjoyed writing most. I think partly because I was freed from the normal constraints of the crime novel, where you're trying to have everything geared towards a particular effect and sort of move the plot forward and do all those things. They were just sort of, I don't know, they sort of stood apart to some extent from the rest of the novel. They were just slightly gratuitous insights into these women's lives, and I found that I found it a bit of a relief from the pressure of trying to tie everything together in the crime novel. So I think they probably sit quite oddly in relation to the novel as a whole, but they're the kind of bits that I actually enjoyed writing most.
Yeah, they seem to really kind of work for me, especially on audio, although it's a while since I actually heard them. Were you influenced in doing that because of your background in journalism and the way that victims are portrayed at all?
Well, I suppose you're always conscious of that, Alex. The fact that victims in crime novels, by definition, tend to be just plot points. And of course, in the sort of golden age crime fiction, that's very explicitly the case. That the victims are often people in a prominent position who are quite unsympathetic, and who we're almost explicitly not supposed to sympathise with, and we don't want emotions to get in the way. Let's just, there's a dead body, let's go on with the business of investigating it. So I suppose it was I think as a lot of recent crime writers have been doing, it was an attempt to just sort of push against that to some extent. It was also, I suppose, the first time, that was my 3rd book, and in the first 2 books, I think all the victims were male. So I suppose it was the first time that I was confronted with that quite familiar and sort of queasy scenario in crime fiction, where you've got the sort of traumatized corpse of the female victim, and then all the agency lies with the male investigator. So again, I suppose it was a way to try to even up that balance to some extent.
I mean, you must be getting quite used to the style of crime fiction now that you're lecturing about it in New Zealand. So, yeah.
You would think so. Yeah, in fact, I was just talking to my wife about this last night. At what point do you work out, right, I now know how to write crime novels, and then you can carry on sort of churning them out, because I seem to have to learn how to write every individual book, which seems to be completely different. And I sometimes think I should maybe try and keep a record of what I'm actually doing when I write the novel, so that I can look back and say, well, that worked, or this didn't. But yeah, I haven't quite found a sort of formula, I suppose. So yeah, I suppose in some senses I'm becoming quite familiar with the genre just through working in it and teaching it. But I'm also very conscious that there's always a lot of learning to do, and every book you write, you have to learn how to write that particular book to some extent.
When writing about Glasgow from the other side of the world, it must be very, well, not as easy as you would be if you're still in Glasgow, I suppose. But
yeah, I think there are plus points and negative points, Alex. I mean, obviously it would be handy to be able to be on the spot and sort of go and check your locations. Although prior to COVID, I was back home quite regularly, often for extended periods. I was back for 6 months in 2018, and we're back for 8 months next year. So I do, in normal circumstances, get a chance to come back for quite extended periods. And I do, when I'm back, I have a sense of what I'm going to write about when I go back to New Zealand. So I tend to sort of tour around those locations and take photographs and so forth. But there's also, I think, an advantage in being at a distance. Sometimes you can, things become a little clearer sometimes from a distance when they're not so clear when you're so close up to them. Well, that's what I tell myself to convince myself that it's a good idea to live 12,000 miles away. But I think the fact that the books I've been writing recently have been historical fiction to some extent, at least, set in the 60s and 70s. There's not so much pressure to, it's already a Glasgow that's gone to some extent, so there's not so much pressure to get everything absolutely, accurate. So I think there can be advantages. I think also that, I spent the first 40 years of my life in the west of Scotland, and your sense of a place, I think, is probably established, by the time you're 7 or 8 years old, never mind 40. So I think to some extent you're drawing on the textures and the smells and your experience of the place in childhood. I think that's true for writers who still live in the place that they write about. So I don't think it's an insuperable difficulty, but it is nice to be able to get back from time to time.
It must be useful to have guest lecturers overweight, and when you've got several like you're going to within the next few weeks, it must be really interesting to be like living hand in glove with so many writers for an extended period, I suppose.
It's going to be great, yeah. So we've got Val McDermid, the Queen of Crime, holds a visiting professorship in Scottish Studies and Crime Fiction in our little Centre for Irish and Scottish Studies. So I co-direct with my colleague Sonia Tiernan a small Centre for Irish and Scottish Studies at University of Otago in the city of Dunedin in the South Island of New Zealand. And Val holds this position. So she comes, the idea is that she comes for a couple of months a year, and she came in 2019 and had a fantastic time. It was very successful and mentored lots of students and did lots of public events. And she was really keen to come back. But of course, COVID intervened. So she wasn't able to return in 2020 and 2021. So this is the first time that she'll be returning. So she's actually arriving on Thursday. And on the same plane, we have Craig Robertson, the Scottish crime writer, and Alexandra Sokolov, who are jointly taking up a writing fellowship at our centre. So yeah, our little building will be crammed to the rafters with excellent crime writers, with these three joining us. So that should be, that'll be great fun. It'll be great for our students to experience and be mentored by those writers. And it's also great for me to be to sort of learn from to have writers sort of, as you say, sort of living hand in glove with them and working with them on a day-to-day basis in the centre. So I'm hugely looking forward to that.
What have you learned from the Antipodean side of things? Because it's getting quite big in New Zealand and Australia as well, isn't it? You've got Jane Harper, all the bigger names, and with the Nia Marsh Awards too.
Exactly, Alex. Yeah. So, I mean, partly that's the emergence of things like Outback Noir on the back of Jane Harper's fantastic books and great success. And there's also some fantastic crime writing in New Zealand. So someone like Vanda Simon, who lives in the same city as I do, writes fantastic crime fiction. There's also been an emergence of Indigenous Maori crime writing with people like Michael Bennett and Josh Pomari. So it's quite an exciting time to be in this part of the world and as someone trying to write crime fiction. There's also, looking a little further back, people like Peter Corris, Peter Temple in Australia. I mean, when Peter Temple was alive, Peter Temple was, for my money, the best sort of sentence by sentence crime writer on the planet. So yeah, it's quite a rich, quite a fertile ground for crime writing. We also owe a lot to Craig Sisterson, who I know you'll be very familiar with, Alex, who's done an enormous amount to promote Antipodean crime fiction, and of course has written an excellent book about Antipodean crime fiction, and also set up the Niall Marsh Awards, and has really been banging the drum for crime fiction from this part of the world in the UK. So I think he's made crime fiction from Australia and New Zealand much better known in the UK than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. So Craig Sisterson has been a big part, I think, of the success of Antipodean crime fiction in recent years. I
must admit, I've been reading Michael Bennett today because I've got an interview with him in September as part of one of the books I'm writing, and I'm really enjoying the Maori side of the writing style. Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, and it's great to see. I mean, there's quite a lot of te reo Maori, so Maori language, used in the books, which of course is something that's very familiar in literary fiction and poetry in New Zealand and in public life. There's a lot of Maori words in use. So it's quite exciting to see that permeating the world of crime fiction too. So I think that book will be a great success. It certainly deserves to be.
Oh, I've been definitely enjoying it. What with you having such a of course you won the McIlvanney Prize, but it's named after your dad, so that must be quite a nice little thing.
Yeah, it's a kind of bizarre one in a way. There was something slightly surreal, in fact, about winning first of all being sort of shortlisted and then winning the McIlvanney. It was nice that it coincided with my family and I were in Scotland for 6 months, so it was kind of all the planets aligned, and it was really quite a moving occasion for us there at bloody Scotland. And of course, the great thing about winning the McIlvanney is you then lead a torchlit procession of the festival goers down through the sort of medieval old town of Stirling. So it's pretty hard to top that. I think that will remain one of the great experiences of my life. It was quite fantastic.
When you heard that Ian was going to finish one of the books of your dad's. Like when he was still writing those in like his little office, you must have seen that as a kid and thought, is that for me, or is it something else that drew you to crime writing?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I remember that as a boy. Obviously, I mean, he left when I was about 10, so I don't remember it. I remember it when I was very young. I remember him writing Laidlaw in our front room, and I remember sitting drawing alternative covers to Laidlaw at our kitchen table. And that was always our front room was, we were always warned, you can't go into the front room because your dad's in there writing. So it was this sort of mysterious activity that he did, and he always wrote longhand in biro on an A4 pad. He didn't even use a typewriter in those days. So it was always this sort of slightly mysterious activity. So I suppose, I mean, it partly made writing seems like something you could do. I mean, he was a school teacher, and then he retired from school teaching in the mid-70s and sort of devoted himself to trying to make a living as a writer, which is not the easiest gig, as we all know. But yeah, so I suppose it made writing seem like something you could have a go at. It was just something your old man did, in the front room with an A4 pad and a biro pen. But to some extent, also, I mean, he kind of when he left, he sort of went off to Glasgow. We lived in Kilmarnock, industrial town south of Glasgow, and he went off to the West End of Glasgow to kind of to write. So it was almost a bit as if the world of writing sort of took him away, took him off to Glasgow. So it also imposed a bit of distance as well. So it was a kind of ambivalent experience of writing. I don't know if that's answered your question, Alex.
A very interesting answer, yeah. I was always curious because I've interviewed a lot of authors now, and journalism has been a route to writing for a lot of them. What did you learn from the offices of a journalist, would you say?
Well, I was always slightly on the periphery of journalism, Alex. I mean, I wrote quite a bit of literary journalism, and I did some stints, very short stints, writing other kinds of journalism. But I was never a proper journalist in the way that Val McDermid or Craig Robertson were, or people like Michael Connolly. So, but I mean, you're absolutely right. I think it's a very well-trodden route into writing crime fiction, and it's always intrigued me what is the basis of that. What are the skills that you learn as a journalist that stand you in good stead when you come to write crime fiction? I guess part of it is just writing to deadline. That you don't have the luxury as a reporter to wait for the muse to strike. You just put park your backside in the seat and hammer out your 800 words or whatever it is. So that hitting your target of words and getting your words out. I suppose if you think what Hemingway learned from being a reporter, just that sort of spare, resonant style that seems to lend itself quite well to crime writing. So I think both from the point of view of style, getting the key facts of the story out on the page, and the discipline involved in writing, it's probably a very good school for people who want to make a go at crime writing. And I suppose what you also find is that people who have done that job properly also produce the goods in terms of crime. Like they actually produce, a lot of books and write a book a year and do the job properly, unlike some of the rest of us.
I've always been really interested into how and why people choose the side of the genre that they've chosen, because historical crime fiction for me has always been the hardest one to think about writing. Although I love it, I'd avoid it generally because it scares me.
Yeah, I suppose I kind of fell into it. I mean, everyone always says that, don't they? I said it wasn't a deliberate thing. I just sort of found myself doing it. But to some extent, I mean, I knew I wanted to write about Bible John, so I thought, well, that's, obviously that's, although I fictionalized it into the Quaker and so on, I maintained it in the same period. So that was, well, I never know if it's historical or not. I mean, Walter Scott basically invents the historical novel with Waverley, or to 60 years since. So, I tend to think of the historical novel as you've got to be 60 years, back into the past, which of course mine aren't. So whether they're fully historical or not might be a question. But yeah, so once I'd written that and then decided to do a sequel, I suppose, yeah, I'm kind of in that, historical fiction vein. So I suppose the thing is partly the research that, you have to get the period detail right, but at the same time you have to avoid sort of overlarding the narrative with things that you've found in your research. That's the great danger, I think, of historical fiction, is that I've done this research, so it's it's going into the book, whether the book actually requires it or not. So you've got to use that stuff sparingly. And I suppose there's the particular challenge of police procedures in that period. So I'm very fortunate that my cousin, David McIlvanney, is a retired firearms instructor with Strathclyde Police, and he was able to put me in touch with a couple of guys who had worked in Glasgow CID at the time of the Bible John. They hadn't actually worked the Bible John case, but they had worked in Glasgow CID at the time. So I was able to sort of badger them about police procedures at the time and how things would work, and they were very helpful. So yeah, I suppose, I mean, I don't think it's a genre that I could see myself working in indefinitely. I mean, I think I'll probably do maybe 4 books in this Duncan McCormick series and then return to the present day.
Given that you started with present day crime fiction, what would you say was your favourite bit about those first two books?
Well, I write so slowly. They're sort of historical artifacts in their own right now, Alex. I suppose it's so long ago. I mean, I suppose with those 2 books, I didn't really. I mean, possibly I still don't know what I'm doing in terms of writing crime novels, but I think one of the things that I've done progressively over the 4 books that I've written is get a clearer idea of structure and how to sort of shape and pace a crime novel. And I think the books have gotten progressively tighter as a result, although the most recent one is quite a large beast. But I quite enjoyed sort of flailing around in those first 2 books without really knowing what I was doing in terms of structure. I was just kind of enjoying the characters and sort of putting sentences together. So I possibly had more fun just in the actual writing process of those first 2 books without really knowing what I was doing. So I kind of think of them fondly in that respect. I also kind of left them hanging. I conceived it as a trilogy, the Gerry Conway books, and I wrote 2 books, and I've kind of left it alone since 2013. So there's a great Scottish New Zealand writer called Alan Sharp, who sadly died a few years ago. But he wrote, in the 1960s, he wrote 2 books of a trilogy, 2 novels in a trilogy. And then he sort of buggered off to Hollywood to write films. Wrote films like The Hired Hand and Night Moves with Gene Hackman and so on. And he just left the trilogy hanging there. And there was always the idea, well, Alan Sharp go back and finish the trilogy. So he's the sort of inventor of the 2-book trilogy. So I feel like like a Scottish New Zealand writer. I've now written my 2-book trilogy, but I should, my intention at some stage is to go back and do a 3rd Gerry Conway book and finally finish that trilogy in some sort of lopsided fashion.
I mean, must be quite intriguing to go back after such a long period of time and think about going back to a series that you've not looked at for ages, because of that being really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be sort of reading. As I say, I tend to, once I've written a book, I almost forget what's in it. And so when you go back to look at a book, it is very often as if someone else has written it. You think, oh God, I can't remember writing this. Or sometimes you go, oh, that's not bad. Wish I could do that now. But so yeah, I'll be intrigued, I think, to go back and read those first two books and see how they hold up, and see how I might sort of put it to bed with a third novel. But it's a bit like, I'm waiting for the second foot to drop. There is that at the back of my mind that I've left poor Jerry Conway hanging there, and I really need to find space in the writing schedule to get that third Jerry Conway book done.
When going back to The Heretic, there's a lot of themes in that. I know it's probably because of the length, but there's very complex themes in there. Homelessness and the bombs and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, I never know how sort of, I don't think I'm particularly conscious of all that stuff, Alex. I think, once you've written a book, those things maybe emerge more clearly, and you can sort of see what your subconscious was up to. And I suppose, people tend to argue that writers return to the same sort of themes and the same concerns book after book, almost whether they like it or not. So I'm sure those things are there, but they're possibly not at the forefront of your mind when you're actually involved in the writing of it. It tends to be, I think, that you're more concerned just with the mechanics of how the plot fits together and sort of what happens next. And those things, I guess, sort of take care of themselves to some extent.
I first became aware of the gender imbalance in the piece thanks to William Shaw and his historical series in the 60s. What's that like when portraying a female character from the 60s?
Yeah, well, I think, it's again, those are the bits I enjoy writing most. I said in relation to the Quaker that I enjoyed writing those chapters from the female perspective most. So I've also introduced a female detective into the Liz Nichol into the Heretic, partly to allow me to write from that perspective a little more. So of course there's a danger, obviously, that you're writing from a perspective that you have to do a bit of work to sort of inhabit. But in a way, that's what makes it interesting for you as a writer. I think it was Andre Gide who said that, if you just write about characters who share all your characteristics, then they become flat. You need a sort of angle of approach that gives you a bit of difference. So a character might share your background in terms, I suppose, of geography or age or whatever. But if you find some other point of difference, that will give you an in to some extent. So I suppose that holds good when you're writing female characters, although it's not something that I think I could sustain, over the course of a novel, just, writing principally from a female perspective. But I do very much enjoy doing it in kind of in little bits and pieces in the novels.
And there's some other interesting themes of the 60s as well, because you deal with I'm trying to think of like the relationships within the 60s, which were frowned upon, I suppose.
Yeah, so again, so Duncan McCormick, my protagonist, is gay, which of course is not the easiest thing to be in Scotland at this period, and particularly if you're in the police. So you've got that tension between someone whose job is to uphold the law, but who's also on the wrong side of the law just because of who he loves and his sort of sexual orientation. So that creates, from the writer's point of view, quite a nice dramatic tension in the books, but it also again gives you that challenge to write from that perspective. So again, I myself am not gay, so that's another sort of, as I say, you've got to try and think your way into this character, and I've had a fantastic session with the Eden Gay Writers Group after the Quaker came out, and I was able to take some of their insights on board for the Heretic. So even little things like, there's a scene in the Quaker, there's a sort of scene of kind of homophobic bigotry in a police station, and the sort of victim of this bigotry is a young gay guy who has a Durex in his pocket, and one of the guys at the Eden Gay Book Group will say, "Well, why does he get that? It's pre-AIDS, it's 1969. Why would he need that?" So there's those little elements that you think, right, obviously, little bits that you get wrong that you can sort of put right in the next book. So I think having people that can sort of check those things for you is always to the good.
With you writing over in New Zealand, you must get loads of different covers throughout the world. I mean, we've got the cover in between us now. What's the New Zealand cover like?
New Zealand cover's exactly the same, Alex. The American cover is slightly different. I don't have it to hand, unfortunately. But yeah, and then I suppose in due course we'll get the French and we've had the Spanish and Catalan ones for the Quaker, certainly El Quaker and so on, which is always quite amusing to see how they. I love to sort of flick through even with languages I don't speak and try and work out, what what's going on, as it were. My French translator, a guy called David Fauconberg, who is a novelist in his own right. Bizarrely, I actually met him in New Zealand. He was over on some sort of fellowship with our French department at the university, and I got a phone call one day. It was the head of French at the university saying, "Do you want to meet your French translator?" So this completely bizarre situation of meeting the French translator of these Glasgow novels in Dunedin in New Zealand. But one of the things that David Fauconberg does in the French translations is he puts little footnotes explaining some of the historical references. And I thought that might actually not be a bad idea in the English version, to explain some of the more arcane sort of historical references in the book. So all that stuff can be very interesting, for me at least.
It's quite interesting you say about the arcane stuff, because if I was looking at the cover and I didn't know that it was in the 70s, you'd think it was an older historical novel from looking at the cover.
Yeah, it's got that feel. It's almost like kind of Jesuit priest sprinting away or sprinting towards you there, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a bit different. Who would you say that attracts you most with their covers? Because you must know a lot of people, and you must have an author that you get interested in. Yeah.
In terms of covers specifically, Alex, I don't know. I mean, things seem to go in sort of waves to some extent, don't they? You get sort of vogues for. There's a lot of kind of, there's always a sort of kind of black, white, and red kind of true crime sort of covers I see creeping into crime fiction now. Yeah, I mean, and sometimes I suppose it can get a little generic. I remember one of I think it was the cover for probably Where the Dead Men Go, the second Jerry Conway book, and there's a Scottish, an Irish Australian crime writer based in Sydney, oh, okay, his name's escaping me at the moment. But I remember seeing our two books. It's a Mac name, so it was shelved next to mine. I remember seeing the two books together, and not only was it very similar setup, but it was actually literally the same image that they had used for my guy and his guy on the cover. It was literally the same guy with his back turned to the viewer. So that's when I realised that these things are probably a little more generic than you realise, and that something is seen to work, and then everybody piles on and sort of uses that kind of imagery. So yeah, in terms of contemporary crime covers that work. Sorry, I'm kind of drawing a blank. I'm obviously not a very visual person. I can't actually think of a crime writer whose covers excite me at the moment.
One of the things that made me think of the question was Christopher Brockmeyer and his earlier series, particularly Attack of the Rubber Ducks. I think that was a good one.
Right. Yeah, and of course he's got that kind of Victoriana thing going on with the Ambrose Parry books, and those covers are pretty nice, aren't they?
Yeah. When it comes to audiobooks, do you listen to a lot? Or...
I used to. I let my subscription lapse, and I keep meaning to renew it and get back into. I do a lot of walking at night. I go a walk for about an hour and 20 minutes every night around the hill suburbs of Dunedin to try to make some sort of stab at keeping fit. And I used to listen to audiobooks. I tend to listen to podcasts now, but I may get back into that. The guy that does mine, Angus King, is fantastic. I really enjoy listening to him, and I've kind of got his voice now in my head when I'm writing Duncan McCormick, so he seems to have kind of taken over as the sort of voice of McCormick, and even in my own head, which is quite interesting. But yeah, I'll probably get back into. As I say, I'm quite an analog. I like a sort of physical book. I've got the Kindle and so on, but I can never quite get as excited about reading something until I have it in my hands and can sort of smell it and get the texture of the pages and so on. I think that sort of sensory element of reading a book is something that's always stayed with me, and that I really enjoy, the kind of tactile dimension to reading a book.
Have you got anywhere specific that you go and read your books? Because of course, with being in New Zealand, the weather's could be a little bit. With it being warmer out there, you don't get the rain, but I imagine you can't sit outside as much as you can here because it gets too hot.
It's exactly the same as Scotland, exactly the same, which was a bit of a hard sell to my wife. We're going 12,000 miles to a climate that's exactly as bad as Scotland's. But yeah, we're down in the South Island in Dunedin. Of course, Billy Connolly's joke was that the Scottish settlers, travelled 12,000 miles, waited till they saw somewhere with sort of horizontal rain and thought, yeah, that's the spot for us. And it's probably slightly drier than the west of Scotland, but not much. And it's really, really cold. I mean, I'm sitting here. Of course, the concept of central heating hasn't penetrated Aotearoa, New Zealand yet. So I'm sitting in my lounge with several layers on in a winter's morning here. So yeah, it's kind of the weather's pretty much the same as home, which I suppose is from one point of view slightly disappointing, but there we are.
Yeah, I always wonder what it's like because my uncle lives in Perth, and that's he lives near.
That's a little warmer, yeah.
Yeah, I'm a little bit.
Perth, Australia, anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a little bit jealous, I must admit, sometimes, but yeah.
Yeah, I remember teaching when I first arrived here. I was teaching a John Burnside poem, which refers to, I think there's a line about the exit lights of Perth and Carden Den, and a hand went up in the class, and somebody said, "Well, is there a Perth in Scotland?" Like, yes, there is actually a Perth. That's when I thought, we're not in Kansas anymore. that the first thing people think of when they hear the word Perth is not what I would think of as the real Perth. So there we are.
So when you're on your walks, do you come up with ideas on your walks, or is it
I
something
do, yeah. I mean, that old thing about actually, the just the sort of motion of walking generating ideas. I think, yeah, and that, in the shower, and that sort of, when you're slightly preoccupied and you're kind of thinking about things but not really thinking about things, that seems to be when your brain solves whatever plot point it is that you need to solve, and something will pop into your head. So I suppose you tend to regard those as moments of inspiration, but they're probably just your brain has been working away on the problem almost in your absence, and then the answer will pop into your consciousness. But yes, it very often happens that it's when you're on a walk that, and then of course you've got to try and get home before you forget what it was. You'd really learn to keep a kind of notebook with me as I trudge round the hill suburbs of Dunedin.
We were talking before we started about the 10 books that you on the course that you'll be teaching. So what are the books that you'll be covering that you could tell the readers about?
Yeah, so this one, in fact, I've got a bookmark with the little list there. So what do we do? So basically, I suppose what I'm trying to do in this course, or paper as they call them in New Zealand, is to some extent give students an introduction to Scottish literature. So it's kind of a Scottish literature survey course masquerading as a crime fiction course. But when you do that, what you realise is the surprising number of classic Scottish novels that you can sort of shoehorn without too much difficulty into a course on crime fiction. So I used to begin with Walter Scott's short story, The Two Drovers, which is 1827, so sort of, predates the Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue by 14 years. But I now begin with Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. We then do Conan Doyle's Hound of the Baskervilles, Buchan's 39 Steps, Josephine Tay's The Singing Sands, which is just one of these glorious books that I look forward to reading every year. Ian Fleming's Casino Royale. So Fleming gets in on the kind of Scottish grandfather rule, rather like sort of international football. Muriel Spark's The Driver's Seat, which is almost a kind of anti-crime novel. Ian Rankin's Black and Blue. Val McDermid's A Place of Execution. Denise Mina's The Long Drop, whose title has a slightly different connotation in New Zealand. She was most amused to learn that a long drop in this part of the world is basically a kind of outside toilet. And finally, Abir Mukherjee's A Rising Man. So, I mean, there's a lot of reading on the paper, but we are trying to cover quite a lot of ground, and the students do seem to enjoy what is quite a kind of fast canter through Scottish crime fiction. And some of the revelations to me are how much they like. Josephine Tay always goes down really well. And Muriel Spark's The Driver's Seat is one of these books, a very short book, quite a controversial book, but that's one of the books that always generates a lot of discussion. You never come into a classroom to teach Muriel Spark's The Driver's Seat and people are completely indifferent to it. They're all raring to go to make their points about the book. And I do a little bit of creative writing teaching along the way. We look at some creative writing techniques. So the main internal assessment, the big essay, they can either do an academic essay or they can do a creative writing option. So I give them that choice, and many of them choose to do the creative writing option. So it's quite a nice little paper. And of course they get the added bonus. I mean, listen to me bang on for the past 7 or 8 weeks. Professor McDermott will be appearing over the next week or two, so they'll get a bit of a break from me, and they'll have the Queen of Crime to explain what she was up to in A Place of Execution, which should be fun.
Why did you choose A Place of Execution as the book or was that Val that chose it?
Yeah, no, it was. I saw she's actually got a little article in the New Zealand Listener, which is a sort of local kind of New Statesman style, front half politics, back half culture kind of magazine in New Zealand, where she talks about, you know, her favourite books. One of the questions is, what's the book of your own that you're most proud of writing? And in fact, she says it's A Place of Execution, which works out quite nicely from purely selfish point of view, given that I'll be teaching it in a week or so's time. But yeah, I think it's just the construction of that book is so sort of daring and, you know, risky and successful. And I think she just does things in that book that I actually reviewed it at the time as a lad in the dim and distant past. I reviewed it for the Glasgow Herald, and I remember just being tremendously impressed at how layered and just the ambition of the architecture, I suppose, of the book, as well as the characterization and how well it was written. So it's nice to get a chance to teach it in the university context, and even nicer to get the author herself to chat to the students about it.
If you were to choose someone to come over that you haven't had yet, who would you choose and why?
I'd love to get Abir Mukherjee to come over. And you know, I think he's got a young family, and you know, it's probably not the best kind of period of his kind of life to be jetting off to New Zealand at the moment. But I just think that's such an interesting series, and sort of moves Scottish crime fiction into a place it hasn't really been before. And again, I just think he just does them so well. The books, just as books, are so sort of propulsive and interesting, and he manages to capture that. I mean, he's dealing with some, you know, quite important and multi-dimensional historical events in the fiction, but he manages to incorporate them into the narrative he's telling quite brilliantly, I think. So it would be nice to get Mr. Mukherjee out at some stage, but we live in hope.
So with about 5 or 6 minutes left, could you tell us what's next, if possible? I know, yeah.
Yeah, so I've one of the things that Val McDermott, although I see she's actually broken this rule herself, but one of the things that I remember Val McDermott saying was that to keep things fresh, it can be quite a good idea not to write consecutive books in a series, to sort of move to a standalone or to a different series. But I see she's sort of flouted that rule, I think, with the Ali Burns books, and written 2 Ali Burns books in a row. Although I think she's about to embark on a Karen Pirie when she lands on the shores of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So with that in mind, I'm about 65,000 words into a standalone, which I suppose is a kind of psychological thriller about a couple and a missing child. And it's set in a wee village called Fairley, which is the wee village that we lived in, my family and I lived in, when we were back for 6 months in 2018, a little village on the Ayrshire coast, just outside the seaside town of Largs. So I'm kind of, as I say, I've probably got about 15,000 words of that to write. It's slightly stalled a bit, so I need to get the finger out and just sort of finish those 15,000 words and get that off the desk. And then I'm back for 8 months next year, and that's a period of research leave from my day job as an academic. And so I'm planning to write the 3rd Duncan McCormick book, which is at this stage called The Penitent. So I'm planning to write that while I'm in those 8 months when I'm home. So those are the next 2 things on the agenda, Alex. And if I manage to get those done, I'll be, that'll be moving at lightning speed by my standards. I've never quite mastered this trick of writing a book a year that proper crime writers do. So I'm hoping I'll get at least a little closer to it over the next couple of years with those books.
Why do you think that you're more comfortable with the longer period? I mean, you're not the only one I know that does it. I mean, Stuart Turton hasn't written a book a year yet, so you're not the only one.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly because it's, although I take it very seriously and very much enjoy it. It still is. It's not my day job. And I know there are lots of other writers who are in the same position. But I really quite enjoy my day job as well. So I've got, I'm the Professor of Scottish Studies at University of Otago, and I co-direct this Centre for Irish and Scottish Studies, which is a reasonably demanding day job. And I've got 4 kids, and I've got all my excuses lined up, Alex, for why I'm so slow. But I think, those things obviously, feed into the situation. I think I'm probably just a bit slow anyway at writing. I do a lot of revision and I revise as I go. And I think it's also just the fact that I'm not depending, as some of the crime writers I know and respect are. I'm not sort of trying to put food on the table through my crime writing, thank goodness. So I don't really have the incentive at this stage to kind of get the finger out and do a book a year. But I should be slightly faster than I am, I think.
I know that a lot of people would have probably started the interview with this. How did you find the job in New Zealand? It's not somewhere where you'd automatically think, given that you weren't born there.
No, I answered an email in an idle moment, Alex, and sort of the rest was history. So it's a job in Scottish Studies, which obviously, in Aberdeen, where I was previously, I was basically teaching Scottish literature in an English department at Aberdeen, and then this job came up in New Zealand. And so you don't really get the chance to ply your trade as a sort of Scottish Studies specialist outside of Scotland very often. There's a Scottish Studies chair in University of Guelph in Canada, and then there's my job here in New Zealand, and that's kind of about it as far as sort of designated Scottish Studies chairs outside of Scotland go. So I kind of leapt at the opportunity, and I didn't really even we still haven't really discussed it. My wife and I, we just sort of thought, would you fancy this? Yeah, let's do it. And we sort of moved our then family of 3 and now 4 boys 12,000 miles away, but we've never regretted it. It's been a great move. I think you regret things in life that you don't do much more than you regret things in life that you do. So I suppose we're now at the stage where, I'm 53, so I've probably got, one more move as an academic left in me. So if I move at some point over the next couple of years, so I suppose I need to decide, are we here for the duration, or will we come back? So I suppose that'll be a decision that we'll need to make over the next couple of years.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us this morning, and hope that this one does just as well as the Quaker did.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to have something to get out of bed so early for, Alex, and best of luck with your own writing. I know that your 2 Writers, 1 Story book is coming out at some point over the coming months, so I wish you every success with that. I'm sure that'll be a great success, and lovely to talk to you as ever.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this evening, and see everybody else later on. Don't know when I'll be back because I'm going back to the writing for a bit. Yeah.
Excellent.
Bye, everybody.